On August 27, 1941, the German submarine U-570 was attacked by a Lockheed Hudson bomber of the Royal Air Force. The attack would lead to the submarine's surrender and capture. It was the only submarine of the Second World War to serve in combat patrols with both the German Kriegsmarine and the British Royal Navy. But U-570 was not the only submarine to have been captured and used by the enemy during the war. The capture of U-570 is perhaps one of the most well-known examples of the capture and later use of an enemy submarine during the war. U-570 was a Type 7C U-boat. The Type 7 was a medium-sized boat intended for the Battle of the Atlantic, although many operated as far away as the Gulf of Mexico. With over 700 built, the Type 7 is the most numerous type of submarine ever built. U-570 was commissioned on May 15, 1941, and the following August was sent to patrol an area south of Iceland. A British report later explained what it described as the most striking issue aboard the boat: the inexperience of the crew. The complement of U-570 consisted of 4 officers, 3 chief petty officers, 11 petty officers, and 25 ratings, making a total of 43. The engineer officer, 1 or 2 petty officers, and 1 rating being the only men to have taken part in a war cruise prior to U-570's first and last cruise. The chief petty officers were men who had been in the Navy for a number of years, the chief quartermaster having joined in about 1926. The average length of service in the petty officers was 3.5 years, while only 1 rating had more than 18 months service. About half of the ratings, all very young, joined the Navy in April 1940, and the other half more recently than that. Most of the technical ratings had done 3 to 6 months U-boat training, and the seamen even less. Even the U-boat's commander, Captain Lieutenant Hans Joachim Ramlow, was a submarine novice. The report explaining Ramlow, aged nearly 32 years, had served in surface craft, notably in E-boats, and had specialized in gunnery and coastal defense. He was stated to only have recently transferred to U-boats, and had commanded a training U-boat in the Baltic for a short time, U-570 being the first active service command in that branch of the Navy. The first officer, Oberlieutenant zur See Bernhard Berndt, was also newly assigned to the undersea service, having previously served aboard destroyers. His crew described him as neither efficient nor knowledgeable. Junior officer, 21-year-old Lieutenant zur See Walter Christensen, was described as hopelessly inexperienced, simple, cheerful, and not very intelligent. Of the officers, the only one with experience was the engineer office, Lieutenant Erich Menzel, who, although a man of considerable experience, was also described as a vulgar little Saxon with an appalling accent, but an enviable flow of invective. The shocking lack of experience was indicative of a growing U-boat fleet that had taken significant losses. Early in the war, U-boat training had been reduced to just 2 months. That issue showed in the fate of U-570. The boat's loss can be partially attributed to seasickness. A British report writes, at about 10:50 on the 27th August, U-570, at this time was diving deep to get some respite from the heavy seas which had already caused much seasickness amongst her crew. Possibly in order to take a sight, her captain decided to surface, and neglecting the elementary precaution of ensuring that it was safe to do so, came up almost immediately underneath a Hudson aircraft belonging to 269 Squadron. The mistake ended the war for the young crew. U-570 perceived her danger too late, and as she was diving, a stick of 4 250-pound depth charges exploded close alongside her. The lights were put out, and some gauge glasses fractured, and it was doubtless the sound of water pouring through these, added to the confusion caused by the blackness, the auxiliary lighting system having failed, and the panic of an inexperienced crew that caused the captain to order the boat to be brought to the surface and surrendered. The action was perplexing to the British. The sea was too rough to sink their ship and take to a raft, and they did not appear to have considered it politic to attempt to drive off the aircraft with their AA gun. Huddled in their miserable position, the crew remained throughout the day. The submarine radioed for help, but it did so in open-playing language, and the message was intercepted by the British. British air patrols deterred any attempt by other German submarines to intervene. The officers had, however, managed to destroy their code books and Enigma machine. U-570 was taken in tow to Iceland. Despite being found in what was described as a chaotic state, the damage was found to be rather light, and engineers were able to restore the boat enough for it to travel under its own power to the United Kingdom for repairs and study. The report concludes she was not captured through any serious defect of material, but as a result of being poorly manned. Despite the destruction of the Enigma machine, the boat produced some intelligence gains, notably a submarine commander's handbook that aided in understanding of operational procedures. The boat was thoroughly tested and produced important findings, notably that the boat could dive deeper than had been expected, leading to modifications to British depth charges, and the capture of the boat was reported in the press, offering a propaganda victory. But the most significant effect of the capture might have benefited the Germans, who, largely as a response to this loss, revised training procedures and initiated a policy of dispersing experienced submarine crews among new vessels to give them a corps of experienced personnel. But notably, after testing and discussions of what to do with the submarine, it was taken into the Royal Navy as HMS Graf, possibly an homage to the number of Grafs produced during its extensive testing. HMS Graf participated in 3 war patrols before being placed in reserve in 1943, there being a shortage of spare parts available for a captured boat. The submarine was used for training and then as a target to test depth charges. Decommissioned on June 21, 1943, the tow line broke as the former U-boat was being towed for scrapping. The hulk was grounded by the Hebrides off of Scotland, and part of the wreck is still visited by recreational divers. It is an interesting story, a nearly new submarine captured and placed into service, but it's not the only such event of the war. In fact, the first submarine to be captured and commissioned by the enemy is far less known, but possibly even more important. HMS Seal was a Grampus-class mine-laying submarine of the Royal Navy. Commissioned in 1939, on May 4, 1940, Seal was on a mine-laying mission in the North Sea when the boat was sighted by a Heinkel HE-115 seaplane. Seal died, but was now being chased by numerous ships as well as by air. In her attempt to escape, HMS Seal struck a mine, taking damage to her stern. Despite valiant efforts by the submarine's commander, Rupert Lonsdale, the vessel was too severely damaged to escape. Despite attempts to scuttle her, Seal was towed successfully to the German naval base at Kiel. The boat was commissioned into the German Kriegsmarine on November 30, 1940. Unlike HMS Graf, the submarine designated UB proved too difficult to refit for combat service. The submarine was stripped and abandoned at Kiel, damaged in an Allied raid on the base in 1945, and finally scuttled. While the capture, HMS Seal was the only submarine of the Royal Navy to surrender during the war, served a propaganda purpose, the effect of the capture was more significant. In the early war, the Germans had difficulty with malfunctioning torpedoes. These difficulties during a critical period were called the torpedo crisis. German engineers studying the torpedoes aboard HMS Seal discovered that their contact pistol detonators were superior to the German magnetic pistol design. Reverse engineered, the new detonators were a significant aid in improving the German torpedoes, enabling the period of devastating U-boat successes called the Happy Time. But perhaps as significant was the capture of the Type 9B U-boat U-110 on May 9, 1941. While attacking a convoy near Greenland, U-110 was attacked by the convoy escorts. Depth charges seriously damaged the vessel. The commander, Captain Lieutenant Fritz Julius Lemp, ordered the boat abandoned, apparently convinced that the boat was sinking on its own. Later, realizing that the boat wasn't going to sink, Lemp either drowned or was killed by a British sailor while trying to swim back to the boat. In any case, the submarine was captured, along with the most important prize, the Enigma machine and codebooks. These were vital to the breaking of the German naval code, a success that allowed Allied convoys to avoid German submarines, saving vessels and lives. Unlike U-570, the British were desperate to keep the capture of the machine a secret, so the capture of U-110 was not reported, and the vessel was deliberately sunk to hide the intelligence coup. Even the Americans were kept in the dark about the capture until 1942. Perhaps the strangest example of capturing an enemy submarine in World War II was a submarine built for the previous war. HMS H6 was one of 42 H-class submarines built for the Royal Navy during the Great War. Commissioned on June 10, 1915, on January 16, 1916, the boat ran aground off the Dutch coast. Holland was a neutral country during the First World War, so in accordance with international law, the boat was interned by the Dutch government. The two governments came to an agreement, and the submarine was officially sold to the Netherlands Navy in May of 1917. Commissioned into the Royal Dutch Navy, oddly parts from a German submarine, the Type UC-1 SM-UC-8, which had been acquired in very similar circumstances, purchased after having run aground in Dutch waters, were used to improve the submarine, which was rechristened HNLMS 08. The boat was still in service with the Dutch Navy when Germany invaded in May of 1940. Unable to escape, the Dutch attempted to scuttle the boat, but the Germans were able to recover it. The former World War I British submarine, that was part World War I German submarine, was commissioned into the Kriegsmarine on November 21, 1940 as the UD-1. She was taken to Kiel and used for training U-boat crews. The aged vessel was decommissioned in 1943 and scuttled in 1945, after 30 years of service in 3 navies. There were similar instances in the Mediterranean. The Italian Archimede-class submarine Galileo Galilei, captured by the Royal Navy on June 19, 1940 after being damaged by the Royal Navy anti-submarine trawler HMS Moonstone, was commissioned into the Royal Navy as HMS X2. Like the former H6, the boat was used for training throughout the war and only scrapped in 1946. Perhaps the most important impact of its capture is that the British claimed to have captured codebooks and operational orders. They hadn't. That was a lie. The Italian crew had destroyed all important papers, but the claim helped to cover British intelligence activities in the Mediterranean. Like the former H6, the Perla-class Italian submarine Perla, captured July 9, 1942, served in 3 navies. Surrendering after damage in a battle with the Royal Navy corvette HMS Hyacinth off Beirut, the boat was commissioned into the Royal Navy as the P-712 and was used to test how advanced Italian submarines were. In 1943, the submarine was transferred to the Hellenic Navy, where it served as the Matrozos until 1954. The Soviet S-class submarine S-1 was captured by the Germans shortly after the Reich invaded the Soviet Union. Having served in the Winter War and the blockade of Riga, which resulted in the Soviet annexation of Latvia and the Baltic states, the S-1 was undergoing maintenance when Hitler unleashed Operation Barbarossa in June of 1941. The crew scuttled the S-1 and escaped on another submarine, but the Germans were able to raise the vessel, which had been lightly damaged. It's unclear whether there was an intent to commission the submarine into the Kriegsmarine, as the boat was sunk while it was being tested. The United States captured its first enemy submarine, the Japanese Type A midget submarine HA-19, the day the United States entered the war. The small, just 78-foot, 5-inch submarine was one of 5 intended to participate in the attack on Pearl Harbor. These small submarines were carried by larger submarines. The HA-19 launched from the submarine I-24, but suffered a failure of its compass. The 2 crew members were unable to enter the harbor, and the submarine was damaged on a reef before being spotted and attacked. Damaged, the crew tried to scuttle the vessel, but a charge designed to destroy the submarine wouldn't ignite. Crew member Kiyoshi Inaki drowned in the attempt, but crew member Kazuo Sakamaki managed to swim to shore and was captured. The submarine washed up on an Oahu beach. After testing, the HA-19 was taken on war bond tours, helping to raise money for the war. In 1989, it was designated a National Historic Landmark and can be viewed at the National Museum of the Pacific War in Houston. And it's not the only enemy submarine on display at an American museum. U-505 is a Type 9C submarine. On June 4, 1944, the submarine was attacked by destroyer escorts and aircraft from an Allied hunter-killer group centered on the escort carrier Guadalcanal. Finally disabled by depth charges from the destroyer escort USS Chatelaine, the U-boat commander, Oberlieutenant Xerxes Harold Lang, ordered the crew to abandon ship. Viewing the damaged U-505 from a life raft, Lang later said, "I ordered the men around me to give 3 cheers for our sinking boat." But a U.S. Navy crew was able to board the vessel and prevent its sinking. The submarine was taken under tow by the Guadalcanal and eventually towed to a U.S. naval base in Bermuda. Like the U-110, U-505 provided a treasure trove of intelligence information, including 2 Enigma machines and codebooks, as well as advanced torpedoes. Not wanting the German High Command to know what was captured, the recovery of the submarine was so secret that the vessel was painted to resemble a U.S. submarine and called USS Nemo, although never actually commissioned into the U.S. Navy. After victory in Europe on May 8, 1945, there was no more need for secrecy, and the submarine was used in a war bond drive. The Navy intended to use the boat for target practice, but Rear Admiral Daniel V. Gallery instead finagled a donation to the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. Chicago residents raised the money to have the submarine taken via the Great Lakes to Chicago and mounted at the museum. After the war, German companies provided equipment to replace that which was lost during the U.S. Navy testing and restore the boat to its former glory. Like the HA-19, the U-505 is now a National Historic Landmark and on display at the museum. After the war, many submarines surrendered, and some served in other navies. But the story of 2 U-boats is interesting. The U-219 and the U-862 were in the Pacific when the Reich surrendered in May 1945, and both were surrendered to the Japanese, where they were taken into the Imperial Japanese Navy as I-505 and I-503. Neither, however, saw Japanese service, as the Japanese Navy was too short of personnel to crew them. Combatants in the Second World War utilized all sorts of captured equipment, from small arms to tanks to even warships, during the war and sometimes for years afterwards. The German Type 7C U-boat U-573 was sold to the Spanish Navy in 1942 and only decommissioned in 1970. But a submarine was particularly difficult to capture intact because it was so easy for the crews to scuttle them rather than surrender them. So the small handful that were captured during the war in operational condition out of the some 2,000 to 3,000 submarines that were utilized by all navies during the war represented important milestones. Sometimes they represented the capture of war-altering intelligence, other times important propaganda victories, and even occasionally they served the navies that captured them. And each capture was, of course, a story all its own. History that deserves to be remembered. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.